The term Allegro is one of our most common tempo markings in music, but when you see one, how do you know exactly how fast you should play? And while the word itself is often translated bright or lively, or even sometimes just fast in music, when you actually try to pin down an exact number, you often get a couple responses that neither one's that helpful. Response number one would be, it's 120. Well, right, but in my piece, 120 feels a little bit weird, and it's 120. It's not really that helpful just to give it one number it has to be. And the second not that helpful response would be, well, it's a big range. You just kind of have to feel it. You gotta know. You gotta play Allegro. And while there is more truth to that answer, it's still not that helpful if you don't know what you're supposed to do, if you don't know how you're supposed to feel, and you're trying to pin down exactly how fast your piece is supposed to go. So in this video, I'm going to give you a much clearer answer so that you will know how fast you're supposed to go next time you're playing a piece of music and it says to go Allegro. So I'm going to start out here by giving you a range to kind of memorize. Think of Allegro on the metronome, beats per minute, as 112 to roughly 144. If you memorize something like numbers-wise, think of 112 to 144. But that immediately kind of brings on the question, how do you know where in that range are we? 112 to 144 is a pretty big difference. So what we're going to do is take the year 1750 and say Allegros work at around 112 pretty well in the year 1750. We're going to fast forward to about 1850 and say by that point, maybe kind of assume your ballpark to start with is going to be around 144. So 1750, kind of near the start where it's like Allegro, a lot of sonatas showing up the 1750s and 60s and 70s. Be thinking on the like 112, 116, 120 range, and kind of gradually speed up your Allegro to the year 1850. We're going to jump right in here now and try to apply this rule to a piece by Haydn. This is Haydn's Sonata number 4 in G major, and it was composed in 1766. So it's more on the early end of this range. So for that reason, I've set my metronome to 112, and we're going to hear how this piece sounds at 112 at the earlier end of our tempo range. So now that we pin down the number 112, we're not going to play exactly 112 necessarily. We're going to add some of that flexibility that comes from that answer I told you was fine, but not very actually helpful, because like saying 112 to 144, 120 to 160, then saying be flexible, that's too big of a range. You could go like be flexible, like twice as fast or twice as slow. But now that we know we're going to be around the ballpark of 112 is where we want to maybe get this to land if possible, we can be flexible with it. So let's say I go a little slower. On my metronome, 2 notches slower is 104. Let's see how this sounds at 104. I actually really like that. I think that sounds great. Now let's try to go a little bit on the upper end of the range. I'm going to speed it up twice, up to 120. It may be a little on the rush side for my take, but this is where some interpretation comes in. So if you kind of get to that 112 range and then drop it 5-10% or raise it 5-10%, you can interpret it kind of your own way. Still add your own character, your own uniqueness to it, but at least you're in the right ballpark. So we're going to say, okay, Haydn said 2-4. The 4 on the bottom stands for quarter note, the fourth note, the quarter note, and we're going to go round 112. Now, as we heard, 108, 104, 116, even 120. All kind of sounded fine, but now we're talking about a pretty small range of tempos to work with. Let's apply this exact same reasoning to Beethoven's Sonata in E major, opus 14, number 1. Here is 112. Okay, here is 104. Doesn't quite feel right, especially that 104 felt quite a bit on the slower end. And that's because this sonata by Beethoven was written in the year 1798 or 1799. So we are moving down our chart where we shouldn't really expect 112, maybe faster, maybe slower anymore, but we should definitely be like around 120 now. So let's do that same thing again at the number 120. All right, let's try to wiggle up a little bit and try 128. I just want to make really clear what I'm doing. I'm sort of finding a ballpark range, a little less than 120 if you're like in the 1750s, a little more than 120 up to 144 if you're closer to the 1850s. Then I'm kind of adjusting up and down. But what I'm not doing is trying to say like, okay, the year is 1807 and I need to go exactly 129.465. That's not really the point. We're not trying to pin down one exact number. What we're trying to do, though, is get much more specific than just saying, well, 112 to 160. In fact, my metronome says 120 to 168. That's just a very big range to deal with, right? Okay, now we're going to skip all the way to the 1850s and look at another piano sonata, but this one written by Johannes Brahms. As you probably can expect, this piece is marked at Allegro, and I'm going to start out by playing it for you at 112, the same Allegro speed that I played the Haydn at the beginning of the video. You see what I mean? Just pretty on the slow side at 112 by this point, because we're kind of at the end of the chart. We should be assuming not just maybe even 120, maybe 130 at this point, maybe like closer to 140. With that in mind, just for fun, let's try this out at 144. That tempo sounds pretty good, right? Now, of course, at this point, if you want to go a little faster, you want to interpret it slightly on the slower side in the upper 120s or 130s range. That's up to your interpretation, but at least it kind of got you in the right tempo range, where I think 144 does sound pretty nice. Okay, so now hopefully you're feeling kind of confident with the word Allegro, but there is a very common problem with Allegro, and that is that composers, especially later on, start putting words with it. Like you might see Allegro moderato or molto Allegro, Allegro vivace, all these terms. Just want to really quickly go over them because they're not that hard. So they kind of know what they mean. So Allegro moderato. Moderato is a slower tempo than Allegro, so just like a moderate Allegro. Like Allegro, but just a little slower. So if you're like sliding scale gets you in the 120, the moderato might drop that a couple. Then you're going to work from that point. Maybe you drop it down to 112, then go up or down from there. On the flip side, you have molto allegro or allegro molto. That means much. Like do a more allegro, so faster. So if you think from the age range of the piece, you're going to be around the 120s. You might want to bump it to the 130s first. This is also true of the term Allegro con brio. A really common marking is Allegro con brio in Beethoven, and you often can be safe playing Beethoven Allegros around that 120, 130 range, but many of them, first movements are marked Allegro con brio, like with brilliance, with like some flair, excitement to them. So what you want to do with those is automatically bump the Allegro up. So if you're like, okay, I think it should be around 120, 128, you might play Allegro con brio at like 140s or 150s. And you're like, well, that's not Allegro. It is. This is an Allegro con brio. The composer has put a modifier into the Allegro. We also have Allegro manantropo. Manantropo means, but not too much motion. So Allegro, but not too much. That's going to be an Allegro, kind of like the Allegro moderato. Allegro, but scale it back a little bit. One other nuance I just want you to be aware of is when the time signature is maybe 3/4 or especially 6/8, 9/8, 12/8. So in 3/4, you should be able to apply all these same rules. However, there are many 3/4 pieces that are Allegro that just makes sense to bump up a little bit in tempo. And that's because 3/4 kind of needs to have a flow and a lilt to it. And sometimes 112 can actually, not 12, or 112 or 120 can feel on the slow side, or maybe 112 too, or even 130. So sometimes Allegros in 3/4 kind of need to have a da-da-da-da-da, like a rolling on forward, not so fast to become 6/8 or something, but just something to be aware of. If you're specifically struggling with the tempo and you feel like it just doesn't feel fast, and you're like, I'm doing what Ryan said, I'm playing a Beethoven Allegro in 3/4. I'm doing 120. I bumped it up to 132. It still feels a little sluggish. If it's 3/4, it might need to go a little faster. Then actually the exact opposite can be true for 6/8, 9/8, 12/8. So what's unique about 6/8, 9/8, 12/8 is these are tempo markings with a triplet feel. Da 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 da. That was like a weird Civil War march or something. What makes these three time signatures unique is that the time signature, whatever the word is, Allegro, is going to apply to the dotted quarter note. If you take Allegro at 120, first of all, you cannot apply it to the eighth notes. Think of like this famous Mozart sonata that goes 120, 1, 2. You apply it to the dotted chord note, which would make it, which is really, really fast. So sometimes you notice that in 6, 8, 9, 12, 8, you kind of have this tendency to have to slow the tempos down just a little bit. This isn't necessarily a rule that you're going to find written down anywhere, but this is just Ryan's practical experience when playing lots of 9/8 pieces for you. They just tend to not quite reach the same number you would typically expect. If you're playing on Andante, they might be a little slower on Andante than maybe a future video where I teach you how to play on Andante. Just kind of knowing you're jumping to 6, 8, 9, 12, 8, you might say, okay, 120. But you might find it feels much better at 100 because, again, it has this triplet feeling. The subdivision is much faster. It actually kind of makes the piece feel more rushed just because it has that triplet subdivision. Before I go, just want to remind you that this channel doesn't grow, doesn't really go anywhere without you guys watching it. So thank you for watching the video, taking the time to check it out. I would love it if you put a like down below, leave a comment, and especially love it if you share it with your friends. And also, I've recently launched a Patreon page. If you want to go check out my Patreon page, see some more content there. Also a great way to support the channel. So thanks for watching. Hopefully you are now going to rock all your Allegros for the rest of your life. See you guys next one.